1. Hello everyone, and welcome to part 2 of my visit with the FCPA professor, Mike Kohler. This is Tom Fox, and welcome to episode 30 of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. I'm really pleased to have a two-part interview with the professor. He shared with me some of the things that are on his mind in Q4 near the end of 2013. We rolled through some of those in part 1, and I would encourage you to go back and watch or listen to those. But Mike, you've provided me with some of your thoughts, and really I think near the top of your list were some remarks by Secretary of State John Kerry. And so could you tell us what's on your mind about those remarks?
Yeah, I just used Secretary Kerry's recent remarks concerning trade agreements as a point of entry into a topic I've frequently been highlighting, and that is how trade distortions and trade barriers are often the root causes of bribery and corruption, and thus often the root causes of FCPA enforcement actions. You know, one of the things that I think people are perhaps most interested when it comes to FCPA enforcement is taking several steps back and asking themselves, well, how did this company ever come into contact with the foreign officials with discretion that served as the foundational basis for the enforcement action in the first place? And I think when you look at FCPA enforcement actions, the primary means in which that occurs is because of a trade barrier or trade distortion. Look at the Weatherford enforcement action from a few weeks ago. And whatever one may think about Weatherford's internal controls and compliance environment during that time period, at least as it relates to conduct in Angola, the root cause of that conduct was a trade barrier and trade distortion that put Weatherford into contact with foreign officials who had discretion over their business. More specifically, Weatherford could not do business in Angola per the DOJ's own allegations unless they had a local sponsor. And that's very common in many countries. Furthermore, even if Weatherford wanted to do business with private customers, as strange as it may sound, an alleged foreign official still had discretionary authority over that private business and whether to allow it to go forward. So trade barriers and trade distortions create bureaucracy. Bureaucracy creates foreign officials. Foreign officials have discretion. So anytime you have a trade distortion or barrier, a company subject to the FCPA is going to be funneled into this arbitrary and discretionary world. And here on International Anti-Corruption Day, I think many in the FCPA and broader space are too focused on enforcement actions, pounding the pavement for more and more enforcement, where at the end of the day, that enforcement is akin to whack-a-mole. It's not going to make a huge difference in changing the overall environment and addressing why, in many cases, this conduct at issue is taking place. So my one wish, perhaps, for International Anti-Corruption Day is that more people are focused on the root causes of bribery and corruption in the first place. And in many cases, those are trade barriers and trade distortions. Now, even though I'm a generally optimistic person, I don't believe much, if any, progress is going to be made on eliminating these root causes of bribery and corruption in many cases. Because every sovereign nation has economic, political, national security, self-interest in having these distortions and barriers in the first place.
Well, let me play Socratic method professor here with you, and let's talk about Mexico in the context of NAFTA. We have a free trade agreement with NAFTA, and at least right now we have one of the largest FCPA investigations ongoing, which started with the country of Mexico, and that of course is Walmart. The allegations as reported against Walmart were for obtaining licenses and permits which may be more less commercial in nature, zoning permits, construction permits, and things that typically would not be thought of as trade barriers or trade distortions, but more local law issues. Certainly, those types of mechanisms are present in the United States. So I'm not sure that it's going to be possible to lower trade barriers and still have the type of less opportunity for corruption, because I think there's always going to be government regulation of land use. There's always going to be government regulation of natural resource use, and I find that an appropriate use of government, exercise of government power.
Yeah, I mean, you cited one anecdotal example, but it doesn't change the fact that in many cases, the root causes of bribery and corruption are trade distortions and trade barriers. Now, of course, here in the United States, we have licensing and permitting process, but what have we talked about in terms of these things in the United States? President Obama has been very clear that we need to reduce the overlap. We need to reduce the redundancy of getting many U.S. licenses and permits. We have competing regulatory agencies with their fingers in the same issue. Now, it's not talked about in terms of bribery and corruption in the United States standpoint, but I think there's wide recognition, including here in the United States, that even with a legitimate licensing and permitting and customs environment, that the inefficiencies and overlap sometimes can relate to unintended consequences, and some of those unintended consequences in many cases are creating the conditions in which harassment, bribery flourishes. So, I mean, time will tell what happens with Walmart in Mexico, but just using that one example, I don't think deconstructs the argument or the point that in many cases, I'm not suggesting all cases, the reason why FCPA enforcement actions happen is because of a trade barrier or distortion. Whether it's because a company must, pursuant to local law, have a local sponsor or third-party agent. These are forced marriages. Whether it's because of some arcane or opaque licensing or permitting or inspection or customs requirement. So I think greater attention needs to be paid to disentangling these issues and allowing trade to be more free. But I'm not optimistic because, of course, every country is going to have these barriers and distortions to protect certain constituencies and for other, in many cases, national security or health and safety reasons.
Okay, let's move on to the next topic, which is something that has certainly bedeviled many of us in the compliance community, the anti-bribery, anti-corruption community, which is the increase in FCPA fines, penalties, in DPAs and NPAs and other enforcement actions over the past few years. And if I could start out by saying that my last corporate position was with the Able Corporation. And in 2007, Able had the largest FCPA fine in the history of the world ever at $27 million. I don't think it makes the top 20 anymore. So you recently wrote about the increase in fines. So what were some of your thoughts along those lines, Mike?
Well, I wrote this post using the recent Diebold enforcement action from October as a way to highlight this issue. Now, Diebold was at its core a travel and entertainment type case, where the allegation is that certain alleged Chinese foreign officials visited the Grand Canyon, went to Napa Valley, saw Hollywood, those type of things. It was a core excessive travel and entertainment case. And the fine and penalty amounts, DOJ and SEC combined, were $48 million. And what I found relevant about that was if you are to put FCPA enforcement actions on a spectrum, right? 10 being a Siemens type case, the most egregious, one being sort of a garden variety type of FCPA enforcement action. The Diebold action would clearly be at the lower end of that scale. And what I thought was interesting, nevertheless, is that that Diebold enforcement action is greater than, from a fine and penalty perspective, the largest FCPA settlement of all time from not 20 years ago, not 15 years ago, not 10 years ago, but merely 6 years ago. A very egregious case involving Baker Hughes, where there were multi-millions of dollars paid in alleged improper payments. So I used the juxtaposition, or whatever you want to call it, of these two enforcement actions that really involve different types of conduct to raise the issue of, FCPA settlements have come a long way in a very short amount of time. And just raising the issue and highlighting it, I think it's good to think about. And that obviously leads to the why question. Just because? Given the general lack of transparency in how these fine and penalty amounts are calculated, we, the public, have very little insight into this process, but it is a given point that FCPA settlements have come a very long way in a very short amount of time.
Now, we do have some information now, and I can't remember what year, but at some point in '09 or 2010 or 2011, the Department of Justice started putting the calculations and scoring under the sentencing guidelines into deferred prosecution agreements. So we generally see a calculation which leads to a range of potential fines and penalties, at least from the DOJ, where it shakes out after that range is sometimes can be actually below the range, sometimes it can be in the middle of the range, low end of the range, depending on the conduct of the parties, or excuse me, of the company, and then the negotiation between the parties. Don't you think that the DOJ should have discretion in these matters, or do you think they need to have a hard and set list of rules that comes up with a specific number?
Well, I think regardless of the answer to that, there should be transparency. I think it's important for listeners to understand that when it comes to DOJ NPAs, there's no transparency. There's just a number in the enforcement agency documents. When it comes to SEC settlement actions, there is no transparency. There is just a number in the enforcement agency documents. Now, in terms of DPAs, I agree that there is generally a sentencing guidelines formula and calculation set out in those documents. But the problem is the most important number when it comes to that guideline calculation often is the net financial benefit that the company allegedly obtained through the improper payments. That number is just put in there. There's very little discussion of how that number was arrived at. And think of a typical licensing and permitting type case. What process does the DOJ or SEC use when calculating net financial benefit in these licensing and permitting type cases? I think that's a great mystery, not only to myself, but in terms of my discussions with practitioners who themselves are kind of in the dark as to how that number is calculated. So given the lack of transparency that happens here, I think it's very difficult to answer the why question, but just posing the question, even if you don't know the answer, I think is a worthwhile exercise.
Well, I certainly agree with that point. Regarding SEC settlements, don't you find that there's information in there regarding the fine directly related to profit disgorgement, if that is included in there?
Well, just because you say disgorgement, what does that really mean? How has that disgorgement been calculated? And then let's take this another level and talk about how the SEC is seeking this disgorgement remedy in many enforcement actions in which they do not charge violations of the FCPA's anti-bribery provisions. Others have termed this non-charged bribery disgorgement. Many people, including former SEC enforcement officials, have criticized the use of the disgorgement remedy in cases in which the SEC does not bring anti-bribery violations. So just because you call something disgorgement, that's not transparency in the sense of we still don't know how that number was calculated. And further to this issue, I think it's very relevant that, let's face it, the classical traditions of bribery are this notion that a company would not have gotten that business but for the improper payments. The truth of the matter is, Tom, that the majority of companies that resolve FCPA enforcement actions are otherwise viewed as companies that are selling the best products for the best prices. Can it truly be said in those cases that the improper payments were the only reason that company received that particular contract? And I just raised the issue of whether that should somehow be relevant in determining disgorgement amounts, because I think it's a bit simplistic to say that Siemens got all of that business solely because of the improper payments.
Well, I don't think any but-for analysis is required, and to try to or require a percentage or even a figure put on the corrupt act, I don't think is something that's required. The companies that have obviously gotten into enforcement actions, or at least have settled via deferred prosecution agreements and NPAs, are, by their own definition, international companies and have to have some product or service that is worthwhile to get them to the position where they can secure or obtain or retain business. But to say you must isolate down the specific amount to a decision to pay or receive a bribe, I don't think is required.
But Tom, you're forgetting that disgorgement is an equitable remedy. It's not a punitive remedy. The statute has fines and penalties. Disgorgement is something completely different. There was a great article recently written by Russ Ryan, a former high-ranking SEC official, which demonstrates this point. Disgorgement is an equitable remedy. It's not supposed to be meant to punish. It's not supposed to be meant to be punitive. But yet, in so many cases, the SEC is using disgorgement in a way that it was never intended to be used.
One of the very first things I learned in civil procedure, because I made the mistake of inarticulating the correct response, was there is but one action, civil and criminal action. There's one set of rules, and I don't find the equitable remedy distinction as persuasive as you do in this case.
Well, I mean, again, let's go to legal authority. Disgorgement has never been challenged in an FCPA enforcement action, but if you look at general disgorgement case law, you'll see many discussions by courts which saying it's equitable in nature. It's supposed to recoup the alleged improper gains. And if the company was going to, in more likelihood than not, receive the contract in the first place, can it truly be said that that's ill-gotten? One of the things that I find very interesting, and NARA Economic Consulting has done some writing upon this issue, is this whole notion that in other areas of law, whether it's tax law, environmental law, antitrust law, etc., there is usually economic principles that are introduced into the fine, penalty, and disgorgement amount stages of those enforcement actions or proceedings. I think the time has come for pure, basic, accepted economic principles to be part of FCPA counsel's package of materials and arguments that they're going to make when meeting with enforcement agency officials. And then you throw in a whole other concept, Tom, is this whole concept of double dipping. The SEC is going after the same amount of pot of money that the DOJ is already collecting. you have publicly traded companies paying twice because of the overlap in FCPA enforcement authority, when if you were dealing with a purely private company, there wouldn't be that double dipping.
And I think that's because the SEC has separate jurisdiction over those public companies that they don't have under the private companies. I certainly understand the sensitivity that companies have to that, but the way the law is written, I find that to be an appropriate set of remedies from both enforcement agencies.
Well, I mean, I agree that the SEC has jurisdiction over FCPA cases, but from the policy perspective, it doesn't change the question of whether double dipping is fair to the company or to its shareholders.
I don't think that the fair was part of it, but perhaps we could even have a fairness podcast one of these days.
I mean, let's face it. Obviously, the FCPA is the law, but due process and equitable principles are relevant to FCPA enforcement, and those are all fairness principles.
We are running up near the end of our part two, and I asked you I said I wanted to talk to you about one of the things that wasn't on your list, which I found very instructive that you've talked about over this semester. And if I could introduce it a little bit, and if I get it wrong, please correct me, but you have surveyed students in your class and various questions about the FCPA, their awareness, other concepts regarding anti-corruption and anti-bribery legislation. And the thing that I found very interesting, obviously they're law students, obviously they're taking your seminar class, so they have a heightened interest, yet they're not lawyers yet, they're not compliance practitioners yet, so they may be closer to the general public than certainly you and I and many of our contemporaries. And I have found that their attitudes, that's not right, the answers they've given you to be instructive about how perhaps a non-lawyer, non-compliance practitioner might view some of the questions you pose. So with that introduction, could you tell us a little bit about the survey and any of the results that you've seen that have drawn your interest?
Yeah, I appreciate that introduction, Tom. This class that I taught this past semester here at Southern Illinois University School of Law was really one of the first of its kind in the country that was specifically 100% focused on FCPA enforcement, FCPA compliance, and related issues. And, I'm not in the least bit passing off these survey results as empirical or statistically valid. It's a snapshot of a certain defined set of people as to their views on these topics. And I agree with you. I think the students make very good survey respondents because they're law students. They are used to legal authority. They are used to this adversarial process. They are used to fundamental legal principles. And there's some significant concerns with this population, this data set, concerning many aspects of FCPA reform. Students generally do not view the current enforcement climate as being as effective as it could be. Students are concerned with the notion that this is a niche area of law, that government enforcement officials enforce the law and then go to the other side. There's concern with that revolving door. There's concern with NPAs and DPAs and the prominence they have in FCPA enforcement. There's wide concern regarding various aspects of FCPA enforcement in the year 2013.
Well, I guess the thing that struck me, in addition to obviously the things you said, was that I think this is information that also needs to be part of the greater conversation. Certainly, you and I talk about it, others in the community talk about it, but by having really non-lawyers express those concerns, it communicates to me that there are some concerns, and that the dialogue needs to continue. And obviously, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and others have been part of that dialogue, but the dialogue needs to go on, be ongoing. And if there are answers to some of these questions, whether they're thought of by you or me or others, but those answers need to be put out for consideration. And that but it just really struck me that the sample of people you were interviewing or surveying rather was uniquely a unique set of law students, yet not in the compliance world. So I took a real interest in that, and I'd like to thank you for doing that.
Well, thank you. And let me just make the point that I think that sometimes when FCPA Inc. participants are responding to survey data or writing about the topics, let's face it, they are doing it with some either direct or indirect potential conflicts of interest there, because what are they trying to do? They're trying to expand their practice. They're trying not to rock the boat with the enforcement agency officials that they may be across the table next week. So among other things, I think this was a highly relevant and valid group of people to take this, perhaps, arguably, more so than people who are dealing with this on a daily basis.
With that, we are near the end of part 2 of my episode with the FCPA professor. I talked about in part 1 how much I've enjoyed debating with him over the past couple of years. I think you've seen or heard over the past 2 episodes a rather lively debate on certain points, and I would encourage you to debate the professor yourself. So with that, Mike, if somebody wanted to email you to engage, how would they get in touch with you?
Yeah, I'm happy to hear from anyone and everyone at FCPA professor at gmail.com.
Mike, I really appreciate you taking the time to visit with me over these past 2 episodes. For those who may be listening, we're planning to do a 2003 FCPA year in review wrap-up, hopefully in the first few weeks of 2014. So I'm certainly going to look forward to that. And congratulations on completing the semester, and look forward to continuing the discussion. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for having me, Tom.